Nobody expected a young defense attorney to stand against one of America's biggest corporations. But when Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth, even Judge Richard Leon was left speechless.
The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the front. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, notebooks open, cameras poised. Legal analysts whispered predictions, their voices low but tense. And curious citizens leaned forward, desperate to witness what many were already calling the trial of the year. The air buzzed with quiet tension. Clicks of cameras, rustling papers, and the faint hum of whispers echoed off the marble walls. But then, everything changed. When Jasmine Crockett stood up to deliver her defense, the entire room fell silent. It was as if time itself paused. Even the reporters stopped typing. All eyes turned toward her. Standing tall, composed, and unshaken, Jasmine carried an energy that instantly commanded respect. She wasn't just another attorney walking into court. She was a force of determination, intelligence, and quiet fire. At the center of it all sat Judge Richard Leon, a man with decades of experience and a reputation for being one of the toughest judges in the country. He was known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue. Very few lawyers ever impressed him, but this moment was different. As Jasmine adjusted her papers and took a deep breath, Judge Leon leaned slightly forward in his chair. His eyes narrowed, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. He had seen hundreds of trials before, but there was something about her confidence, something unspoken, that told him this was not going to be an ordinary day in court. The case before them had already captured national attention. A powerful corporation was being accused of exploiting hundreds of workers, men and women who had labored tirelessly only to be denied fair pay and basic rights. The evidence seemed one-sided. The corporation had deep pockets, top lawyers, and political influence. Most people thought it was an open and shut case. The defense didn't stand a chance. But Jasmine Crockett was not most lawyers. She had taken on the case not for fame, not for money, but because she believed in something far greater: justice. She had spent weeks poring over thousands of pages of legal documents, uncovering details everyone else had ignored. Every night she worked late, studying, connecting dots, preparing for the moment that would decide everything. And that moment was now. She rose from her seat, smooth and confident, her calm presence filling the room. Her eyes scanned the faces in front of her, the jury, the reporters, the anxious workers sitting in the back row who had placed all their hope in her. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm but calm, the kind of tone that carried both authority and empathy. "Your Honor," she began, pausing for just a heartbeat, "today isn't just about law. It's about justice that has been delayed for far too long." The words hung in the air like thunder. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. With every syllable, there was emotion, strength, and purpose. It didn't sound like a lawyer reading a prepared statement. It sounded like truth being spoken aloud for the first time. Even the opposing attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wasn't expecting this kind of fire. He had underestimated her. The audience leaned forward, their eyes glued to Jasmine. You could feel the change in the room, a shift in energy. Suddenly, it wasn't about documents and technicalities anymore. It was about people. It was about right and wrong. Judge Leon rested his chin on his hand, listening intently. He had seen passionate speeches before, but Jasmine's composure was something rare. There was no arrogance, no exaggeration, just raw conviction. Outside the courtroom, live reporters whispered updates into their microphones. Social media buzzed. Clips of Jasmine standing tall in that packed courtroom began circulating online. People who had never cared about the case before were now watching, waiting, and rooting for her. Back inside, Jasmine continued, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. We've heard arguments about numbers, contracts, and statistics, but behind every number is a name. Behind every policy is a person. These workers are not just signatures on a paper. They are fathers, mothers, and sons, people who believed that fairness still existed in our system. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from emotion. And that emotion was contagious. A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. Even the toughest faces softened. Judge Leon slowly removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if to steady himself. He had heard hundreds of lawyers speak in his lifetime, but rarely did he feel something stir inside him during a case. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as everyone waited for his response. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on Jasmine. "Miss Crockett," he said quietly, "please continue." And just like that, it was clear. This wasn't just another trial. Something extraordinary had begun in that courtroom, something that would be remembered long after the verdict was read.
For weeks, the prosecution had ruled the courtroom like a storm. They came armed with boxes of files, stacks of evidence, and a team of high-priced lawyers who seemed to speak a language ordinary people could barely understand. They were confident, too confident. Every witness they called, every exhibit they showed, felt like another nail in the coffin of Jasmine Crockett's case. To most observers, it looked hopeless. The prosecution's narrative was clean, rehearsed, and powerful. The corporation they represented appeared untouchable. Their lawyers smiled during recesses, whispering to reporters that the defense was hanging by a thread. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Jasmine Crockett never slept on a losing case. While others rested, she stayed awake under the dim light of her office, surrounded by papers, photos, and files scattered across her desk. Coffee cups piled up beside her laptop. She read through every document line by line, searching for anything, one inconsistency, one hidden truth that could turn the tide. She watched witness recordings over and over, noticing small hesitations, nervous glances, things the prosecution ignored. She even visited the factory where her clients had worked, walking through the dusty floors and broken machines, trying to understand their struggle firsthand. To Jasmine, this wasn't just a legal fight, it was personal. Her clients weren't just names on a file. They were fathers who missed meals to feed their children, mothers who worked double shifts without pay, and elderly workers who had been silenced when they dared to speak up. They had trusted her with their story, and she refused to let that trust break. So when the day came for her to take the floor, she didn't walk up to the bench like a defeated lawyer. She walked like someone carrying the truth itself. The room fell quiet. Cameras shifted toward her. Even the opposing attorneys stopped whispering. Jasmine took a slow breath, looked at Judge Richard Leon, and began. "Your Honor," she said softly, "we've heard plenty about contracts, numbers, and policies, but let's talk about what those words really mean. Let's talk about the people behind them." She began pacing gently in front of the jury box, her voice steady and warm, every word deliberate. Behind every contract is a worker. Behind every policy is a family. Behind every paycheck is a life. The line hung in the air like an echo. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with quiet conversations moments before, went completely silent. You could almost hear people breathing. The prosecutor, who had been scribbling notes moments earlier, froze with his pen mid-air. Even the journalists who had sat through dozens of courtroom dramas put down their notepads, realizing they were witnessing something different. Jasmine turned toward the jury. Her eyes were calm, but her words struck with precision. "The prosecution wants you to believe this is about paperwork, but it's not.
It's about broken promises. It's about workers who were told their loyalty mattered until it didn't. She pointed gently toward her clients, sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom, men and women dressed in simple clothes, their faces marked by fatigue and hope. They showed up every day. They worked in dangerous conditions. They believed in this company. And what did they get in return? Layoffs, lost wages, and silence. Her tone grew heavier. They were told to sign contracts they couldn't read, threatened when they asked questions, and ignored when they complained. And now, this corporation dares to claim innocence? Her words hit like thunder. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. One of the corporate representatives whispered something to his attorney, his face pale. Jasmine stopped pacing and looked straight at the judge. "Your Honor, I've reviewed every policy this company has written. Every page says profit over people. But laws were not written for the powerful. They were written to protect those who have no power. And that's what this courtroom stands for. Justice, fairness, truth." The way she said those last three words, justice, fairness, truth, made even the coldest hearts in that room feel something. Judge Leon's expression softened. He wasn't a man easily moved by speeches, but Jasmine's sincerity pierced through the walls of legal formality. It was no longer just a case, it was a moral reckoning. Even one of the jurors, a middle-aged man who had been expressionless for days, nodded slightly. Others exchanged glances, their faces showing empathy rather than skepticism. Jasmine's client, an elderly worker in his 60s, quietly wiped a tear from his cheek. For the first time in months, he felt like someone truly saw him. As Jasmine concluded, her voice lowered but carried even more power. This case isn't about contracts, it's about conscience. It's about whether we believe that people matter more than profit. She returned to her seat, her footsteps echoing softly on the courtroom floor. No one dared to speak. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was awe. Judge Leon leaned forward, tapping his pen against the bench, deep in thought. He didn't say it aloud, but in that moment, he knew the balance of this trial had just shifted. And Jasmine Crockett, the lawyer everyone had underestimated, had just begun to rewrite history.
Then came the moment that would change everything. The courtroom had already seen its share of surprises, but no one was prepared for what Jasmine Crockett was about to reveal. She stood up slowly, a quiet confidence in her every move. There was something different in her tone now, measured, deliberate, and calm, the way someone speaks when they know they're holding a secret that could alter the course of history. "Your Honor," she began, "with the court's permission, I'd like to present one final piece of evidence." The prosecution's lead attorney raised an eyebrow. He leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly. "Another document, Miss Crockett? Haven't we seen enough of your paperwork?" But Jasmine didn't even glance his way. She continued, "This document was recently uncovered during a secondary review of the company's archives. It was buried under outdated expense reports, likely placed there intentionally." She handed a small folder to the bailiff, who walked it up to Judge Richard Leon. The judge opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the first few lines. Then his gaze stopped. He looked up sharply. "A handwritten note?" he asked. Jasmine nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, written by one of the company's senior executives." At first glance, the paper looked simple, slightly yellowed, the ink faint with age. But what it contained would make headlines across the country. Jasmine stepped closer to the jury box, holding up a copy for them to see. At first, this note looked like nothing, just another memo. But when we read it carefully, we realized it was something far more dangerous. She cleared her throat and began to read aloud. Her voice was steady, but every word hit like thunder. "Continue operations as usual. Do not disclose worker injuries or overtime violations to regulators. Handle internally. Destroy all prior reports immediately. The words echoed through the courtroom like a shockwave. Gasps erupted from the audience. Even the journalists, who were used to courtroom drama, stared in disbelief. The workers sitting in the back row clutched each other's hands. They had known the truth for years, but this was proof. Jasmine looked up from the paper, her eyes locked with Judge Leon's. "Your Honor, this note confirms that company leadership not only knew about the violations, they ordered them to be covered up." Judge Leon leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, his voice low but firm. "Miss Crockett, are you certain about the authenticity of this document?" That question hung heavy in the air. The prosecution's lead attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection! This could be a forgery. We haven't had the chance to—" But Jasmine raised her hand calmly. "Actually, Your Honor, that's already been addressed. The handwriting has been verified by 2 independent experts. Both reports have been entered into the court record." She turned a page in her binder and continued, "And if I may direct your attention to page 42 of the prosecution's own submitted evidence." She paused, looking directly at the opposing counsel. It contains a signature from the same executive. When compared side by side, the handwriting matches perfectly. The prosecution attorney froze mid-sentence. His expression fell as he realized what she had just done. She had used their own evidence against them. The silence that followed was electric. You could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Cameras zoomed in on every face. The jurors, the executives, the judge, the lawyers. The corporate executives who once sat confidently in their expensive suits were now pale, whispering to one another in panic. One of them dropped his pen, his hand trembling. Judge Leon flipped through the pages again, his face unreadable. Finally, he looked up at Jasmine. His voice, once firm and skeptical, had softened. "Proceed, Miss Crockett." That single word, "proceed," was like a spark. Jasmine stepped closer to the jury, her voice gaining power with every sentence. This company spent years building an image of success and responsibility, but behind closed doors, their leaders were destroying evidence and silencing workers. This note, this single page, is proof that truth was never their goal. Profit was. She laid the document gently on the evidence table. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this isn't just paper. It's the voice of every worker who was told to stay silent." The audience was spellbound. Even the judge's clerk stopped typing to listen. Judge Leon leaned back in his chair, studying Jasmine carefully. He wasn't a man easily impressed, but in that moment there was a flicker of admiration in his eyes. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "I've seen hundreds of attorneys argue before this bench. Few ever deliver evidence this clear, this decisive, and this courageous." Jasmine simply nodded. She wasn't there for praise. She was there for justice. And while the courtroom sat frozen in stunned silence, the world outside began to shift. Reporters were already rushing out to send breaking news alerts. Headlines would soon read, "Shocking evidence revealed in courtroom. Jasmine Crockett exposes corporate cover-up." But inside that room, no one was thinking about headlines. Everyone was thinking about truth, and how one determined lawyer had just changed the game. As the judge signaled for a brief recess, Jasmine finally allowed herself to breathe. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her papers. She had done it. She had pierced the shield of power with nothing but evidence, courage, and conviction. And deep down, Judge Richard Leon knew this wasn't just a case anymore. It was history being written. One page, one voice, one truth at a time. The air inside the courtroom was heavy. Hours of arguments, cross-examinations, and evidence had brought everyone to this moment.
And now it was time for Jasmine Crockett's closing argument, the moment that would define not only the case but her entire career. The crowd shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward, others clasped their hands tightly in anticipation. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to fade away as Jasmine rose from her chair. For a long moment she said nothing. She simply stood there, tall, calm, and resolute. Her eyes moved slowly across the courtroom. She looked at her clients, the factory workers who had endured years of silence and mistreatment. Their faces told 1,000 stories: fear, hope, exhaustion, and faith. Then she turned toward the jury. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady but full of emotion. "Justice isn't about who has the most money," she began. "It's about who has the truth on their side. My clients don't have expensive lawyers or corporate shields. What they do have is honesty, and that should count for something." You could hear a pin drop. Every person in the room felt the sincerity behind her words. The prosecution's attorneys sat motionless, their confidence draining away with each sentence. The jurors leaned in, hanging on every word. Even Judge Richard Leon, who had seen decades of lawyers come and go, watched her with a quiet intensity. Jasmine took a step closer to the jury box, her tone softening but gaining depth. "When this trial began, we were told this was about contracts, paperwork, and technicalities. But you've seen the truth. You've seen the memos. You've heard the testimonies. You know what really happened. This case is not about paperwork. It's about people." Her words flowed with rhythm, each one carrying more power than the last. She wasn't just arguing law anymore. She was speaking to something deeper, something human. If we allow power to silence the truth, then justice becomes a privilege, not a right. She paused there. The weight of that line seemed to freeze the air. You could hear the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. No one dared move. Even the reporters, who were normally busy jotting down every word, had stopped writing. Jasmine took a slow breath and continued, her voice growing stronger. "But if this court stands for what's right today, it won't just deliver justice for my clients. It will restore faith in the very system we all depend on." As she spoke, her words didn't just echo in the courtroom. They landed in people's hearts. One of her clients, a woman in her 40s, quietly covered her mouth to hold back tears. Another man, who had worked for the company for over 20 years, bowed his head and closed his eyes, as if silently thanking her. Jasmine turned toward them briefly, her expression soft. These people believed in hard work. They believed that if they did their jobs honestly, they'd be treated fairly. That's all they ever wanted. And today, you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have the power to make sure that belief still means something. Her words rolled through the courtroom like a wave of truth and courage. Even those who had entered skeptical, those who thought she was too young, too emotional, too inexperienced, were visibly moved. You could see it in their eyes. Something had shifted. She took one final step forward, placing her hands gently on the edge of the jury box, her tone softening but gaining depth. "When this trial began, we were told this was about contracts, paperwork, and technicalities. But you've seen the truth. You've seen the memos. You've heard the testimonies. You know what really happened. This case is not about paperwork. It's about people." Her words flowed with rhythm, each one carrying more power than the last. She wasn't just arguing law anymore. She was speaking to something deeper, something human. If we allow power to silence the truth, then justice becomes a privilege, not a right. She paused there. The weight of that line seemed to freeze the air. You could hear the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. No one dared move. Even the reporters, who were normally busy jotting down every word, had stopped writing. Jasmine took a slow breath and continued, her voice growing stronger. "But if this court stands for what's right today, it won't just deliver justice for my clients. It will restore faith in the very system we all depend on."
As she spoke, her words didn't just echo in the courtroom, they landed in people's hearts. One of her clients, a woman in her 40s, quietly covered her mouth to hold back tears. Another man, who had worked for the company for over 20 years, bowed his head and closed his eyes, as if silently thanking her. Jasmine turned toward them briefly, her expression soft. These people believed in hard work. They believed that if they did their jobs honestly, they'd be treated fairly. That's all they ever wanted. And today, you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have the power to make sure that belief still means something. Her words rolled through the courtroom like a wave of truth and courage. Even those who had entered skeptical, those who thought she was too young, too emotional, too inexperienced, were visibly moved. You could see it in their eyes. Something had shifted. She took one final step forward, placing her hands gently on the edge of the jury box, her tone softening but gaining depth. When justice isn't measured by wealth or status, it's measured by truth, and today, the truth is standing right here in front of you. The silence that followed was absolute. For a full 10 seconds, no one breathed. Then, slowly, Judge Leon leaned back in his chair. His usually stern face softened, and for the first time all trial, a faint smile appeared. He glanced down at his notes, then looked back up at her. "Miss Crockett," he said quietly, "that was remarkable." Those words, simple yet powerful, echoed through the courtroom. It wasn't often that Judge Leon, known for his strict discipline and impartial demeanor, offered any form of praise. But in that moment, everyone knew they had witnessed something special. Jasmine gave a polite nod, her expression calm but her eyes glistening. She returned to her seat, her heart pounding. Her clients reached out, squeezing her hands in silent gratitude. The jurors sat motionless, lost in thought. The prosecution's team looked defeated, their earlier arrogance replaced by quiet disbelief. For a brief, unforgettable moment, the courtroom wasn't just a place of law, it was a stage of truth. Jasmine's words had transformed it into something sacred. Reporters would later describe it as one of the most powerful courtroom speeches of the decade. Clips of her closing argument would spread across television and social media. People who had never followed a legal case before found themselves inspired by her courage, her clarity, and her unwavering belief in justice. And though she never raised her voice, her message rang louder than any shout could. Justice belongs to everyone. Truth has no price tag. And courage, real courage, is standing tall even when the odds are against you. That was the message Jasmine Crockett left behind that day. And as the court adjourned for the jury's deliberation, one thing was clear. No matter what the verdict would be, Jasmine had already won something far greater: the respect of the judge, the admiration of the public, and a permanent place in the hearts of everyone who witnessed her fight for truth.
The courtroom was silent, too silent. You could almost hear every heartbeat, every nervous breath. After hours of tense deliberation, the jury finally filed back into the room. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that wraps around your chest and won't let go. Jasmine Crockett sat at her table, hands clasped together, her expression calm, but her eyes filled with the quiet storm of hope and fear. Her clients, the exhausted, hopeful factory workers, looked toward the jury box, praying for justice they had long been denied. Judge Richard Leon entered, his presence commanding instant silence. He looked at the jury, then at Jasmine. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his deep voice echoing through the chamber, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. He was an older man, his face lined with emotion. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked directly at the judge and spoke clearly, words that would change everything. "We, the jury, find in favor of the defense." It took a second for the words to register. Then, all at once, the courtroom erupted. Gasps, cheers, and even a few sobs burst from the audience. The workers clung to one another, some crying openly. Reporters scrambled toward the exits, desperate to be the first to break the story that was already destined for every headline in America. Jasmine didn't move right away. She sat still, her mind trying to process what she had just heard. Then, slowly, she smiled. The kind of smile that comes only after surviving the impossible. She turned to her clients, whispering, "We did it. You did it." Judge Leon tapped his gavel, calling for order, but even he couldn't hide the faint curve of a smile tugging at his lips. When the room finally quieted, he looked at Jasmine, his expression filled with something rarely seen in his courtroom, pure admiration. "This court," he said firmly, "commands the defense for its diligence, its clarity, and above all, its courage. Justice," he added, pausing as if to let the moment breathe, "has been served." Applause broke out again, restrained at first, then unstoppable. For the first time in weeks, the courtroom, once a place of conflict and intimidation, was filled with hope. As Jasmine gathered her papers, she took one last look at her clients. They weren't just workers anymore. They were survivors, symbols of resilience in a system that too often forgets the powerless. When she stepped outside, the courthouse steps were a sea of flashing cameras and microphones. Reporters from every major network surrounded her, shouting questions over one another. "Miss Crockett, how did you manage to turn this case around? Did you know the jury would rule in your favor? What does this victory mean for labor rights nationwide?" Through the noise and chaos, Jasmine smiled, her voice steady and sincere. "The truth," she said, "always finds its way out. You just have to fight hard enough to let it shine." That single line would become the quote of the day, replayed across television networks, trending on social media, and printed in bold on newspaper headlines. The truth always finds its way out. But it wasn't just her words that captivated people. It was her grace, her composure, and her unwavering belief in justice. She hadn't just won a case. She had reignited faith and fairness, showing the world that courage could still overcome corruption. Inside the courtroom, Judge Richard Leon remained seated for a long time after the crowd had left. He glanced over his notes, the evidence, and finally the verdict slip. Then he leaned back and exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "In my years on this bench," he said quietly, speaking to the empty chamber, but knowing his words would echo beyond it, "rarely have I witnessed such grace, precision, and courage in a courtroom. Miss Crockett's defense will be remembered as one for the history books." And he was right. That trial didn't just end with a verdict. It sparked a movement. Workers from across the country began sharing their own stories, inspired by Jasmine's unbreakable resolve. Law students studied her arguments, talk shows debated her tactics, and within weeks, new reforms were being proposed to protect employees from corporate exploitation. But through all the attention, Jasmine remained humble. When asked how it felt to become a national icon, she simply replied, "I didn't do this for fame. I did it for the people who thought they didn't have a voice. Today, we reminded them they do." As night fell over the city, the courthouse lights dimmed, but the story of Jasmine Crockett versus the corporate giant continued to burn brightly in headlines, in hearts, and in history. And somewhere in his chambers, Judge Richard Leon smiled once more, whispering words that would summarize it all. "Justice may be slow," he said, "but when it comes, it roars."